The spotless marble floors and sparkling wine glasses in the ballroom reflected the golden light from the chandeliers overhead. I examined the gathering from just inside the entryway, the thick material of my trench coat settling about my boots. There was a lot of laughter and kind applause, but my gaze kept going to my father-in-law, Robert, who was sitting in his chair as if he owned the place. He leaned toward the man next to him and grinned when he saw me. The words slipped across the room and struck me with the flat thud of something I'd heard 100 times before. Just an office clerk in uniform. He didn't try to drop his voice. My heart was steady, almost calm, because I had practiced this moment so many times in my mind. Tonight, however, they felt different, like the prelude to something that only I knew was coming. The MC's voice came through the speakers, smooth and formal, thanking the guests for their service and attendance. "Brigadier General Jessica Morgan, please come forward," the MC said, and the words seemed to hang in the air for a beat, as if the room itself had forgotten how to breathe. I watched as a champagne flute fell out of someone's hands and shattered on the floor in a shower of glass and bubbles. Mark's eyes widened, his mouth opening as though to speak but finding nothing to say. Robert's smirk disappeared, replaced by a blank stare that seemed to rob him of all his usual swagger. Helen, my mother-in-law, reached for his arm as if to steady herself, her eyes darting from me to the MC in shock. The murmurs started. Little ripples at first, then grew into a gentle wave of questions and whispers. I moved forward, the trench coat swayed with every step, my eyes focused on the podium. Each face I saw carried a unique blend of interest, bewilderment, and recognition. The years of quiet service, of being ignored and disregarded, pressed against my ribs like a weight I'd learned to bear without complaining. Were pressed against my ribs like a weight I'd learned to carry without complaining. Tonight wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about finally standing where I'd always belonged, in plain sight, with nothing left to hide. The MC smiled as if he had been waiting all night for this revelation, and the applause began tentatively before growing as more people realized what they were witnessing. I let the moment, meeting Robert's gaze from across the room, and for the first time since I'd known him, he had nothing to say. I lifted my chin and took my place on stage, the question hanging between us all. When I first met Mark, he was a newly minted lieutenant who was still learning how to stand without looking like he was posing for a recruiting poster. I outranked him by a notch, which he found amusing and a little intimidating. We clicked right away, mainly because he was charming in that effortless way, and I was willing to let him have the spotlight. At the time, I thought that letting someone else shine was just being courteous, and I didn't realize how quickly it could become a habit. A few months later, during a long weekend in Georgia, Robert greeted me with a firm handshake and a once-over that felt more like an inspection. He was a retired Marine with 3 tours in Vietnam, a chest full of ribbons, and a strong conviction that the only true soldiers were the ones who kicked down doors. Helen smiled warmly at his side, but Roberts was the kind of person who made the room come alive. After the introductions, he poured himself a bourbon, sat down in his recliner, and asked if I liked setting up coffee machines for the Army. I smiled because I thought he was kidding, and I told him that I oversaw millions of dollars in military assets, coordinated movements across time zones, and kept entire units in operation without firing a shot. He took a sip, nodded once, and said, "So, spreadsheets." Helen attempted to shift the topic, but it was too late. It was the first time I had ever experienced the pain of being reduced to a punchline in my own story. Then he returned his attention to the TV. I laughed it off as Mark drove me back to base that night, but it was more than just the words. It was the way Robert dismissed my entire career in less than a minute, as if the work I did didn't count because it didn't come with a rifle in my hands. It was the beginning of a pattern I would see repeatedly, where my role was invisible unless it could be summed up in terms of combat. At the time, I told myself it was just one bad first impression. I didn't yet know it was the first chapter of years spent in the shadows. I wasn't the person you saw in pictures shaking hands on a tarmac. I was the one on a secure line at 3 a.m, rerouting a convoy of emergency medical supplies to a Puerto Rican hospital before a hurricane made landfall. Then there was the cyber breach that nearly brought down the Eastern Seaboard's banking network. It began as a small suspicious data packet buried in a vendor's invoice, and I caught it because I'd spent years staring at movement logs and could sense when something was out of place. Within days, I had 6 agencies in coordination, servers running hot, and a small war being fought through code. We stopped the attack before the markets even realized they were under threat, and the financial collapse that could have followed would have made national news for years. But the story was over before it began. It's a strange feeling to be both indispensable and invisible. The work I did saved lives, protected the economy, and kept our allies safe. But it existed in a world my family didn't want to look at. I carried that silence for years, telling myself I didn't need their recognition. However, there were nights when I sat alone in my apartment after a mission, staring at the wall and wondering what it would be like if just once they looked at me the way they looked at Mark. Robert talked about Mark's most recent training exercise at Sunday dinners, as if he had defended the nation on his own. Helen asked if I was enjoying my desk job, and I learned to smile and say it was going fine. I didn't ask him about it, and I didn't slam doors or demand answers, but I did what I'd been trained to do in every high-stakes operation. I observed. I logged dates, times, and details in a small leather-bound notebook, the kind I used for classified briefings. Each entry was clear and clean, stripped of emotion, just like an intelligence report. It began slowly, the way hairline cracks appear in a wall long before it collapses. Mark stayed later at work, came home distracted, and left his phone face down on the table. At first I told myself it was just the stress of his assignments, but the signs kept piling up in neat, undeniable rows. A hotel charge that didn't match his travel orders. A civilian contractor's name that appeared in his email threads more frequently than mission updates, and the faint scent of perfume that wasn't mine. I would lie in bed with him at night, his breathing steady and unfazed, and mentally go over the file I was building, because in my line of work, you never act without knowing the full extent of the situation. I was gathering information on the quiet battlefield my marriage had become, and I knew deep down that I was preparing for a mission he wouldn't see coming. The call came on a Tuesday morning as I was going over a logistics report, and the voice on the other end used my full title, Colonel Jessica Morgan, and informed me that the Department of the Army had approved my promotion to Brigadier General. I hadn't applied for it. Someone high enough had read the right files and decided it was time. There was a pause before General Parker spoke again, and I could hear the smile in his voice when he said, "Let them underestimate you." They offered to have the ceremony at the Pentagon, quiet and contained, as was customary for intelligence officers. I thought of Mark's next award banquet, the stage already set for his moment, and I sensed the shape of an idea forming. I answered, always. The ballroom at the Willard Hotel glittered under crystal chandeliers, each drop catching the warm light like frozen sparks. This time they would see me on my terms and there would be no mistaking who I was. It was no longer about proving them wrong, but rather about taking control of the story. The MC read his citation, transforming routine logistics work into the language of battlefield heroics. Robert sat in the front row, his hands folded in satisfaction, his chest puffed, as if the entire event were evidence of his own legacy. A brass band played a medley of patriotic tunes, the notes bouncing off marble floors and gold-trimmed walls. Mark stood at the center of it all, with his polished shoes and a smile that looked rehearsed but was charming enough to pass. When Mark took the podium, his voice was steady, carrying just enough humility to sound genuine. "And to my wife, Jessica, for keeping the trains running," he said, turning to face me. The room echoed with laughter, the kind that fills a room but still hurts. I maintained a neutral expression as though the remark had just slipped by. I took note of the moment inside and filed it away like a classified file entry. The cheers increased once more. I could feel the excitement building in my chest like pressure before a storm as the brass band began to play. Helen smiled and straightened the hem of her skirt as Robert relaxed back in his chair, content with the scene. With trembling hands and a trail of cops, Mark exited the platform, his metal gleaming in the illumination. I waited for my cue while still sitting with my coat buttoned. With the knowledge that the show was almost finished, the air in the room felt heavy and dense. The beauty of it was that they believed that the climax had already passed. The rest, they believed, was finger food, coffee, and courteous small conversation. I sat there knowing that they were just a few seconds away from discovering that Mark had nothing to do with the night's true headline. With a pleasant yet formal tone, the MC took a step back toward the microphone. His words, "Before we close, we have one final unscheduled announcement," left the air hanging. Some shifted in their chairs in anticipation of a small token of appreciation or a housekeeping remark. This honor is given to a person whose strategic leadership recently stopped a massive cyber attack on the Eastern Seaboard banking system. A field promotion to Brigadier General has been approved by the Department of the Army, he added. The room was silent for a heartbeat, save for the faint hum of the air vents. Robert's eyes widened as if he had completely misread the scene. Helen's hand flew to her mouth and Mark froze mid-blink, lips parting without sound. I got up from my chair, unfastened my trench coat, and let it slide from my shoulders. The white service jacket caught the light and 2 silver stars gleamed at my collar. The applause started politely, then got louder as rows of officers stood one after another until most of the room was on its feet, and when I spoke, my voice carried without strain. I walked toward the stage, each step steady, each click of my heel a reminder that I belonged here. General Parker met me at the podium, shook my hand, and pinned the medal with a grip that felt like acknowledgement. With a faint smile tugging at the corner of my mouth, I said, "I won't go into my career. A lot of it is classified, but I will say this support is not less. Strategy is not soft. Logistics is not a background." I let the silence subside before continuing. There are names behind every medal pinned on a chest that you'll never know. People who built the bridge in the dark so others could cross into the light. My eyes passed over Robert, Helen, and then Mark before returning to the crowd. As the ceremony came to an end, a small line formed in front of me, and officers I hardly knew shook my hand and offered firm congratulations. You don't need a rifle to serve. Sometimes all you need is a chair no one thought mattered and a spine of steel. The applause roared, breaking whatever spell had held the room still. I stepped back from the microphone, not needing to say more. The moment was mine, and it had taken years to arrive. The applause had subsided, but the energy in the room continued to hum as a few of them mentioned missions they had read about in briefings, but had never connected to a name. A young cadet who appeared to have rushed over stepped forward near the middle of the line, her cap slightly skewed, and she leaned in just enough to whisper, "I didn't know we could be that." Her voice carried a mix of awe and hope that caught me off guard. I smiled and told her, "You can." It was the truth, but it wasn't a speech. I saw them when the line thinned. Robert, Helen, and Mark stood together near the corner of the room, half in shadow, watching me. I didn't move toward them yet. The distance between us felt like a part of the change that had just started. 6 months later, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, I pulled into Robert and Helen's driveway. Robert's posture had softened, no longer braced in that unwavering Marine stance. Helen's eyes were moist, and Mark kept shifting his weight as if he wasn't sure whether to step forward. The house appeared the same from the outside, but when I entered the living room, I noticed a new glass display cabinet against the far wall, which held my Brigadier General medal and a picture from the night of the ceremony, framed in soft light. Robert came in from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel, and looked at the cabinet and then at me, saying, "It took me too long to see what I was looking at." His voice was full of acknowledgement, not sarcasm, and I nodded, not needing more. The conversation that night over dinner was lighter than I had anticipated, and at the end, Mark put down his fork and looked directly into my eyes. "I'm sorry," he began, "for making you the background in our lives. Sometimes words simply serve to dilute the moment." I waited for a while before responding. "You are the only one who can determine your worth." He nodded. And for the first time in years, I believed we could both understand what that meant. If you've ever been misjudged, you know the ache of someone looking straight at you and still not seeing you. There are times when the world needs you to speak, and sometimes the silence you carry is not weakness at all, but strength. Waiting for the right moment. I'm not telling you to fight every battle or correct every insult that will drain you faster than any hard day's work. You know what it's like to have your work, your effort, and even your identity reduced to a footnote. For years, I told myself that silence was the price of maintaining peace, thinking that if I worked hard enough, the results would speak for themselves. What I'm trying to say is that you should never confuse being ignored with being irrelevant. Your value is yours, and no one else can take it unless you give it to them. I worked in the background for years, moving pieces no one saw, making calls no one knew about, and solving problems before they were ever made public. For a long time, I allowed that invisibility to convince me that I didn't deserve to be seen. But I've learned that you can stand your ground quietly until the time comes to step forward, and when it does, you can walk into the light without flinching. There are people everywhere who have been told they are less than they are, and some of them are sitting next to you right now. Some of them are listening with you, and some of them are waiting for a story like yours to show them they can do it too. I want to hear your stories if you're listening to this and remembering all the times you bit your tongue or smiled through someone's dismissive comment. The next time someone looks at you and says you don't belong, remember that they're looking at a chapter, not the entire book. You know the work you've done, you know the roads you've walked, and when the time comes for you to take your space, I hope you do it with the kind of quiet certainty that makes the entire room turn to see who you've been all along. I want to hear about the times you stood your ground or the times you're still waiting to take your stand. Share your thoughts in the comments section, one story at a time, one voice at a time.